When a guilt-ridden Civil War veteran living in complete isolation discovers a freezing pregnant woman collapsed in the snow outside his remote Wyoming cabin, his decision to offer shelter sets in motion a chain of events that will either destroy him or finally grant him the redemption he spent years believing he doesn't deserve. But what happens when the men hunting her reveal a connection to his darkest war memories and force him to choose between the safety of solitude and a love worth dying for? The gunshot echoed across the frozen valley like thunder, sending a murder of crows exploding from the pine trees in a black cloud of wings and harsh cries. Jacob Crane lowered his rifle and watched the deer collapse into the snow, its dark blood spreading like spilled ink across the pristine white canvas of the Wyoming wilderness. It was December 15th, 1867, and winter had come early to the territory, bringing with it the kind of bone-deep cold that could kill a man in hours if he wasn't careful. Jacob had learned to be very careful during his 3 years of living alone in this remote valley, 40 miles from the nearest settlement of Beacon's Ridge. The deer would provide meat for weeks, assuming the wolves didn't find his cabin before he could properly cure the venison. He slung the rifle across his broad shoulders and trudged through the knee-deep snow toward his kill, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. At 34, Jacob had the weathered face of a man who had seen too much and the steady hands of someone who had learned to rely only on himself. His dark hair was longer than it had been during his army days, and his beard helped protect his face from the harsh mountain winds. The cabin he called home sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering evergreens, their branches heavy with snow that sparkled like diamonds in the pale morning sun. He had built the structure himself using logs from the surrounding forest, creating a sanctuary that was both fortress and prison. The walls were thick enough to keep out the cold and any unwanted visitors, while the single room inside held everything a man needed to survive: a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, shelves lined with books, and a bed he had crafted with his own hands. As Jacob field-dressed the deer, his mind wandered to the memories that haunted his sleep like restless ghosts. The Civil War had ended over 2 years ago, but the images from battlefields across the South remained as sharp and painful as the day they were burned into his mind. He could still hear the screams of wounded soldiers calling for their mothers, still smell the acrid smoke of gunpowder mixed with blood and death. Most clearly, he remembered the weight of Lieutenant Marcus Hale's body in his arms as his friend died at Antietam, pressing his gold pocket watch into Jacob's palm with his final breath. The watch ticked steadily against Jacob's chest now, a constant reminder of the good men who had died while he lived on. He pulled it from his vest pocket and checked the time in early noon. The ritual was automatic, performed dozens of times each day, though time had little meaning in his isolated world. Days blended into weeks, marked only by the changing weather and the gradual shortening of daylight as winter tightened its grip on the mountains. A sound made him look up from his work, the distant whinny of a horse carried on the wind. Jacob froze, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. In 3 years, no one had found his hidden valley. Travelers took the main trails through Devil's Pass, 20 miles to the south, avoiding the treacherous terrain that surrounded his homestead. Anyone who ventured this far into the wilderness was either lost, desperate, or looking for trouble. He finished his butchering quickly, hanging the venison in the small smokehouse he had built behind the cabin. The horse sound had not repeated, and he began to wonder if he had imagined it. The isolation played tricks on a man's mind sometimes, creating sounds and voices where none existed. He had learned to distinguish between real threats and the phantoms of loneliness, though the line grew thinner with each passing month. The snow began falling again as Jacob carried the last of the meat inside, fat flakes drifting down from a gray sky that promised a long, hard storm. He built up the fire in his stone hearth and settled into his favorite chair with a cup of bitter coffee and a book of poetry by Walt Whitman. The words on the page seemed to mock him with their celebration of human connection and brotherhood concepts that felt as foreign to him now as speaking Chinese. Outside, the wind picked up strength, howling through the trees like the voices of the dead. Jacob tried to focus on his reading, but his attention kept drifting to the windows and the door, some primitive instinct warning him that his solitude was about to be shattered. He set the book aside and checked his weapons. The Colt was loaded, the rifle cleaned and ready, and a shotgun hung above the fireplace within easy reach. Old habits from the war died hard, especially when survival depended on constant vigilance. The pocket watch chimed softly, marking another hour of his self-imposed exile. Jacob had chosen this life of isolation deliberately, believing that a man who had failed so many others deserved nothing better than loneliness. He had led soldiers into battles they couldn't win, had watched friends die because of orders he had given, had survived when better men had fallen. The guilt was a weight he carried willingly, penance for sins that could never be forgiven. As darkness began to fall early, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of blue and purple, Jacob prepared for another long winter night. He banked the fire carefully, ensuring it would burn until morning, and checked the heavy wooden bar that secured his door. The cabin was warm and dry, a haven against the brutal cold outside, but it felt more like a tomb than a home. Thunder rumbled overhead, unusual for a snowstorm, and Jacob realized his mistake. That hadn't been thunder he had heard that morning. It had been the sound of his rifle shot echoing off the mountains. The noise might have carried for miles in the thin air, alerting anyone within range to his presence. He cursed himself for the careless mistake, knowing that even the smallest error could prove fatal in this unforgiving land. The pounding on his door came like hammer blows against an anvil, urgent and desperate enough to wake the dead. Jacob jolted from his chair where he had dozed fitfully, the book of poetry tumbling to the floor as his hand flew to his weapon. The fire had burned low during the night, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls, and for a moment he wondered if the sound had been part of a dream. "Please!" The voice that pierced the howling wind was high and breathless, clearly belonging to a woman. "Someone help me! I'm freezing out here!" Jacob moved to the window and peered through a gap in the wooden shutters he had closed against the storm. Through the swirling snow, he could barely make out a dark figure hunched against his door, one arm raised to pound again on the thick oak planks. His mind raced with possibilities. Bandits sometimes use women as bait to lure unsuspecting men into traps, and he had not survived 3 years in the wilderness by being careless about strangers. "State your business," he called through the door, his rifle ready in his hands. "What brings you to my valley in the middle of a blizzard?" "My horse," came the reply, broken by chattering teeth and exhaustion. "Broke his leg in a prairie dog hole 5 miles back. Been walking since yesterday morning." "Please, sir, I'm with child and I can't feel my feet anymore." The mention of pregnancy gave Jacob pause. Even the most hardened criminals rarely used pregnant women in their schemes, and the genuine desperation in the voice suggested real distress rather than deception. Still, caution had kept him alive when boldness had killed his friends, and he would not abandon it now. "How do I know you're alone?" he asked, moving away from the door to a position where he could cover both the entrance and the windows. "How do I know this isn't some trick to get me to open up?" A sound that might have been laughter or sobbing drifted through the wood. "Because, sir, if I had companions foolish enough to be out in this weather, they would be pounding on your door alongside me, instead of letting a pregnant woman beg for shelter by herself." The logic was sound, and Jacob found himself impressed by the woman's ability to reason clearly despite her obvious distress. Most people in her situation would be too panicked to think straight, but she had managed to present a convincing argument even while freezing on his doorstep. It spoke to a strength of character that reminded him of the best soldiers he had known during the war. "Step back from the door," he instructed, making his decision. "Keep your hands where I can see them when I open it." Jacob lifted the heavy wooden bar and pulled the door open just wide enough to get a clear look at his unexpected visitor. What he saw made him forget every precaution his paranoid mind had constructed over the past 3 years. The woman who stood shivering on his porch was perhaps 25 years old, with dark hair plastered to her head by melting snow and green eyes that seemed to glow in the firelight spilling from his cabin. Her cloak was soaked through and frozen stiff, and her lips had taken on the blue tinge that warned of serious cold exposure. but it was the unmistakable swell of her belly beneath the heavy wool that convinced him of her honestish was indeed pregnant, and quite far along from the look of it. "Thank God," she whispered, swaying on her feet as relief weakened her resolve. "I thought I was going to die out there." Jacob caught her as she started to fall, his arms wrapping around her slight frame as he pulled her inside and slammed the door against the howling wind. She was lighter than he had expected, despite her pregnancy, and he could feel her violent shivering through the wet fabric of her cloak. Her skin was pale as parchment and cold as marble, warning signs that she was dangerously close to freezing to death. "Get these wet clothes off," he ordered, guiding her to the chair closest to the fire. "Hypothermia will kill you and the baby both if we don't get you warmed up quickly." The woman nodded weakly, her fingers too numb to work the clasps of her cloak. Jacob helped her out of the frozen garment, averting his eyes as much as possible while still ensuring she could manage the task. Beneath the cloak she wore a simple brown dress that was damp but not soaked, and her leather boots were in better condition than he had expected. "My name is Elizabeth Moreau," she said through chattering teeth as Jacob wrapped a thick blanket around her shoulders. "I was traveling from Cheyenne to my sister's place in Oregon when the storm caught me." Jacob poured hot coffee from the pot that sat perpetually warming near the fire and pressed the steaming cup into her hands. "That's a dangerous journey for a woman in your condition. Why didn't you wait for spring?" Elizabeth wrapped her fingers around the warm metal, sighing with relief as feeling began to return to her extremities. "My husband died at Vicksburg last summer. His family, they don't approve of me keeping the baby. They think a child of Moreau blood belongs with them, not with some poor farm girl from Missouri." The casual way she mentioned her husband's death at the siege of Vicksburg hit Jacob like a physical blow. He had been there too, had seen the horrors of that brutal campaign that had finally broken the back of the Confederacy. How many widows had that battle created? How many children would grow up never knowing their fathers because of orders given by men like him? "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly, meaning every word. Vicksburg was. It was hell on earth. Elizabeth looked up at him with new interest, studying his face in the firelight. "You were there?" Jacob nodded reluctantly, not wanting to discuss his war service, but unable to lie to this woman who had suffered her own losses. 5th Ohio Infantry. "We were part of Grant's siege lines from May through July." "Daniel served with the 31st Missouri," Elizabeth said softly. "He wrote me letters about the trenches, about how the men lived like moles in the ground for months. He said the Union soldiers were just as scared and homesick as his own men, that war made brothers of enemies and enemies of brothers." The observation struck closer to home than Jacob cared to admit. He had indeed felt kinship with some of the Confederate soldiers they had fought, recognizing in their faces the same exhaustion and desperation he saw in his own men. The war had been a machine that devoured young men regardless of the color of their uniforms, leaving behind only ghosts and regrets. "Your husband sounds like he was a wise man," Jacob said, refilling her coffee cup. "It takes courage to see past the hatred and find the humanity in your enemies." Elizabeth smiled sadly, one hand moving unconsciously to rest on her swollen belly. "Daniel always said the bravest thing a person could do was choose love over fear, hope over despair. Even when everything seemed darkest, he believed there was still good worth fighting for in the world." Jacob felt something twist painfully in his chest at her words. When was the last time he had chosen hope over despair? When had he last believed there was good worth fighting for? The questions were uncomfortable ones, forcing him to confront the emptiness of the life he had built in his mountain sanctuary. "How far along are you?" he asked, changing the subject to safer ground. 7 months, maybe 8. The baby moves constantly now, especially at night." Elizabeth's expression softened as she spoke of her unborn child. "Sometimes I think he's going to be a dancer, the way he kicks and spins in there." "Hey, just a feeling." Daniel was convinced it would be a boy. He had already picked out names: Marcus if it was a son, Grace if it was a daughter. She paused, noticing the way Jacob had gone perfectly still at the mention of the name Marcus. "Is something wrong?" Jacob's hand moved instinctively to the pocket watch in his vest, fingers tracing the smooth gold surface through the fabric. Marcus was my best friend during the war. He died at Antietam, saving the lives of his men. I'm sorry, Elizabeth said gently. It must be painful to carry such memories. Sometimes I think the dead are the lucky ones, Jacob admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. They don't have to live with what they've done. Don't have to wake up every morning wondering if they deserve to survive when better men didn't. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with those perceptive green eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a wisdom that seemed far older than her years. My grandmother used to say that guilt was just pride wearing a different dress, she said softly. That sometimes we hold on to our pain because it makes us feel important, like our suffering somehow honors the dead. But Daniel always believed the best way to honor the fallen was to live fully, to love deeply, to find joy even in the darkest times. Her words hit Jacob like a slap across the face, forcing him to confront truths he had spent 3 years avoiding. Was she right? Had his self-imposed exile been less about honoring the dead and more about wallowing in his own guilt? The possibility was too painful to examine closely, so he pushed it aside and focused on more immediate concerns. The storm looks like it's getting worse, he said, moving to check the shutters. You'll need to stay here at least until it passes. I've got supplies enough for 2, and there's a bed you can use. Elizabeth nodded gratefully, exhaustion finally overtaking her as the warmth of the cabin seeped into her bones. Thank you, Mr. Crane. Jacob Crane. Thank you, Jacob Crane. You may have just saved 2 lives tonight. As Jacob watched her settle into the bed he offered, pulling the heavy quilts up to her chin, he wondered if she might have saved something in him as well. For the first time in 3 years, his cabin didn't feel like a tomb. The crash of splintering wood jolted Jacob from sleep like a cannon blast, followed immediately by Elizabeth's sharp cry of pain from across the cabin. He rolled from his makeshift bed on the floor, Colt in hand, expecting to find intruders breaking down his door. Instead, he discovered Elizabeth doubled over beside the overturned chair, one hand pressed against her lower back, while the other gripped the edge of his wooden table so hard her knuckles had turned white. The baby, she gasped between ragged breaths. Something's wrong. It feels like someone's twisting a knife in my spine. Jacob holstered his weapon and moved quickly to support her weight, his heart hammering against his ribs. In all his years of war and wilderness living, he had never felt as helpless as he did in this moment. Gunshot wounds he could handle, broken bones he could set, but the mysteries of childbirth were as foreign to him as flying to the moon. How long have you been having pains? He asked, guiding her back to the bed with gentle hands. Since before dawn. I thought it was just the baby moving, but they're getting stronger. Another wave of pain struck her, and she bit down on her lower lip to keep from crying out. It's too early. The baby isn't supposed to come for another month at least. Jacob's mind raced through everything he knew about emergency medicine, which wasn't nearly enough for this situation. He had assisted the army surgeons during the war, had seen men die from wounds that should have been survivable, and others live through injuries that should have killed them instantly. But delivering a baby was entirely different territory, especially one coming too early. We need to get you to a doctor, he said, already moving toward his coat and boots. Beacons Ridge has a medical man, Dr. Patterson. I can have you there by nightfall if I push hard. Elizabeth shook her head weakly, her face pale as fresh snow. The storm, Jacob. Look outside. He moved to the window and pulled back the shutters, cursing under his breath at what he saw. The blizzard had intensified during the night, creating a white wall of wind and snow that reduced visibility to mere yards. The drifts against his cabin walls had grown to nearly 4 feet, and the howling wind suggested the storm was far from finished. Attempting to travel in such conditions would be suicide for all 3 of them. Then we'd do this here, Jacob said with more confidence than he felt. Women have been having babies without doctors for thousands of years. We'll manage. Elizabeth managed a weak smile despite her pain. Have you ever delivered a baby before? No, but I've read about it in medical books. And I've got steady hands and a strong stomach. He moved to his bookshelf and pulled down a thick volume on field medicine he had acquired during his army days. Besides, you're going to do most of the work. I'm just here to catch. The humor in his voice seemed to calm her slightly, and she settled back against the pillows he arranged behind her. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Jacob Crane." "Probably both," he admitted, stoking the fire higher to warm the cabin. "But we don't have much choice in the matter." As the morning progressed, Elizabeth's labor pains grew stronger and more frequent. Jacob found himself transformed from hermit to nursemaid, boiling water, gathering clean cloth, and trying to remember everything he had ever heard about childbirth. The medical book provided some guidance, but its clinical descriptions felt inadequate when faced with the reality of Elizabeth's suffering. Between contractions, they talked to distract her from the pain. She told him about her childhood on a small farm in Missouri, about meeting Daniel at a church social, and falling in love with his gentle smile and kind heart. Her stories painted a picture of a simple but happy life, full of the everyday joys and sorrows that Jacob had forgotten existed. "What about you?" she asked, during a brief respite from pain. "What did you do before the war?" Jacob paused in his preparations, surprised by how difficult the question was to answer. "I was a teacher," he said finally. "Had a small schoolhouse in a town called Millbrook, Ohio. 23 students, age 6 to 16. "You taught children?" Elizabeth's eyebrows rose in surprise. "I can see it now that you mention it. You have patient hands, and you explain things clearly." The observation struck Jacob as both accurate and painful. He had loved teaching, had found deep satisfaction in watching young minds grasp new concepts and grow in understanding. But the war had burned that innocent joy out of him, replacing it with knowledge too dark and terrible to share with children. "I could never go back to it," he said quietly. "Not after what I've seen and done. Children deserve teachers who still believe the world is fundamentally good." Elizabeth reached out and took his hand in hers, her grip surprisingly strong despite her condition. "Maybe the world needs teachers who understand that goodness is something worth fighting for, not something that just exists naturally." Her words echoed something Daniel had apparently said to her, and Jacob wondered what kind of man her husband had been to inspire such wisdom in his wife. The thought brought with it a familiar stab of guilt. There he was, helping to bring Daniel Moreau's child into the world, while the man himself lay cold in some unmarked grave at Vicksburg. Another contraction seized Elizabeth, stronger than any before, and Jacob pushed aside his brooding to focus on the immediate crisis. Her breathing became labored and her face flushed with exertion as the baby began its journey into the world. Jacob positioned himself at the foot of the bed, his hands trembling slightly despite his earlier boast about steady nerves. "I can see the head," he announced, amazement coloring his voice. "Elizabeth, you're doing great. Just a little more." The next few minutes passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Elizabeth pushed with reserves of strength Jacob didn't know she possessed, while he provided what encouragement and assistance he could. The medical book lay forgotten on the floor as instinct and desperation guided his actions. Then, with a final push that left Elizabeth gasping for breath, the baby slipped into Jacob's waiting handstanny, perfect and utterly silent. Jacob's heart stopped as he looked down at the motionless infant. The baby was smaller than he had expected, its skin pale and waxy, and it made no sound at all. He had witnessed enough death to recognize it, and for a moment he was certain they had lost the child, despite all their efforts. "Is the baby okay?" Elizabeth asked weakly, trying to raise her head to see. "Why isn't it crying?" Jacob's military training kicked in, pushing aside panic in favor of action. He cleared the baby's mouth and nose with his finger, then turned the infant face down and patted its back firmly. Nothing. He tried again, harder this time, remembering how the army medics had revived men who had nearly drowned. Still nothing. Desperation drove him to try something he had seen done to a soldier who had stopped breathing after being pulled from a river. Jacob placed his mouth over the baby's tiny face and breathed gently into its lungs, then pressed lightly on its chest. Once, twice, 3 times. A weak cry filled the cabin, thin and reedy but unmistakably alive. The baby's skin began to pinken as its lungs filled with air, and its tiny fists waved weakly in protest at being forced into this cold, bright world. "A girl," Jacob announced, his voice thick with emotion as he wrapped the infant in a clean blanket. "You have a daughter, Elizabeth." Elizabeth wept openly as Jacob placed the baby in her arms, all the fear and pain of the last few hours dissolving into pure joy. The infant was indeed small, but she seemed alert and healthy despite her early arrival. Her eyes were the same deep green as her mother's, and she had a cap of dark hair that reminded Jacob painfully of the husband she would never know. "Hello, little Grace," Elizabeth whispered, using the name Daniel had chosen for a daughter. "I'm your mama, and this is Jacob. He helped bring you into the world." Jacob watched mother and daughter with an expression he couldn't quite identify. Something fundamental had shifted inside him during those terrifying moments when he thought the baby might die. For the first time in 3 years, he had fought for life instead of dwelling on death, had chosen hope over despair, just as Elizabeth's husband had counseled. "She's beautiful," he said softly, and meant it completely. As Elizabeth nursed her newborn daughter, Jacob cleaned up the cabin and tried to process what had just happened. He had helped bring new life into the world, had been present at one of creation's most profound miracles. The experience left him feeling changed in ways he didn't fully understand, as if some long-frozen part of his heart had begun to thaw. Outside, the storm continued to rage, trapping them together in their small circle of warmth and light. But for the first time since coming to this remote valley, Jacob didn't mind being confined. He had found something worth protecting, something that made his exile feel less like punishment and more like preparation for this moment. Grace slept peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware that her arrival had already begun to transform the bitter hermit who had caught her first breath into something resembling the man he used to be. The riders appeared like dark ghosts through the swirling snow, their horses steaming in the frigid air as they approached Jacob's cabin with the measured pace of men who knew exactly where they were going. Jacob spotted them first, through a gap in the shutter's 5 mounted figures moving in formation across his valley, their weapons clearly visible even at a distance. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, not wanting to wake baby Grace but needing to alert the new mother to their danger. "We have company." Elizabeth looked up from where she sat, nursing her 3-day-old daughter, immediately reading the tension in Jacob's voice and posture. "How many?" "5 that I can see, armed and moving like they've done this before." Jacob checked his rifle and moved to a better vantage point. These aren't lost travelers or trappers looking for shelter. Through the window, he could see the lead rider more clearly, now a well-dressed man in an expensive coat who sat his horse with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. Behind him rode 4 others who had the hard look of professional gunmen, the kind of men who solve problems with bullets rather than words. "It's Charles," Elizabeth whispered, her face going pale as she recognized her brother-in-law through the glass. "He found us." Jacob's blood turned cold at the confirmation of his fears. Charles Moreau had tracked them through one of the worst blizzards in memory, bringing hired killers to claim a newborn baby from its mother. The man's determination spoke to a level of ruthlessness that made Jacob's skin crawl. "How did he know where to find us?" Jacob asked, his mind racing through possibilities. "This valley isn't on any map." Elizabeth shifted Grace to her shoulder, her hands trembling slightly as she patted the baby's back. "Charles has connections everywhere. Army scouts, territorial marshals, traders who know every trail in Wyoming. He probably put a bounty on information about a pregnant woman traveling alone." The riders had stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, close enough to call out but far enough to avoid immediate gunfire. Jacob could see them talking among themselves, no doubt planning their approach. The smart thing would be to negotiate, to try to resolve this without bloodshed. But one look at Elizabeth's terrified face told him that Charles Moreau wasn't the kind of man who negotiated. "Mrs. Moreau." The voice that carried across the snow was cultured and smooth, with the practiced tone of someone accustomed to command. "I know you're in there. Come out, and we can discuss this like civilized people." Elizabeth clutched Grace closer to her chest, her maternal instincts overriding everything else. "He'll take her," she whispered to Jacob. "He'll take my baby, and I'll never see her again." Jacob felt something dark and protective rise in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his army days, when he had been responsible for the lives of his men. But this was different, more personal. Elizabeth and Grace weren't soldiers under his command. They were innocents, who had sought shelter and found themselves trapped in a war they hadn't chosen. "No one's taking your daughter," he said firmly, meaning every word. "I give you my word on that." "You don't understand," Elizabeth said desperately. "Charles has money, power, connections. He owns judges and lawmen across 3 territories. Even if we fight him off now, he'll just come back with more men." "Then we make sure he doesn't want to come back," Jacob replied, his voice carrying a hard edge that Elizabeth had never heard before. This was the tone of Lieutenant Jacob Crane, the man who had led soldiers through hell and somehow brought most of them home alive. Outside, Charles was growing impatient with the lack of response. "Mr. Crane, yes, I know who you are. We've met before, though you might not remember. Perhaps we can discuss our mutual interests, like gentlemen." Jacob frowned at the unexpected claim of previous acquaintance. He was certain he had never met Charles Moreau before, yet something about the man's voice nagged at his memory like a half-remembered dream. Where could their paths have crossed? "5 minutes, Charles called out. "Then my men come in shooting. I'd hate for there to be any unnecessary bloodshed, especially with a newborn in the cabin." The casual threat against Grace ignited something primal in Jacob's chest. He had spent 3 years believing himself a coward, a failure who had survived through luck rather than skill. But the thought of these men harming an innocent baby awakened the soldier he had tried so hard to bury. "Elizabeth, take Grace and get in the root cellar behind the kitchen," he ordered, his voice carrying unmistakable authority. "There's a hidden entrance under the loose floorboard. Stay there no matter what you hear." "I won't hide while you face them alone," Elizabeth protested, even as she gathered up her daughter and the blankets. "This is my fight, Jacob." "No, it's mine now," Jacob replied, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. "The moment they threatened your baby, they made it personal." Elizabeth hesitated at the entrance to the root cellar, looking back at the man who had shown her nothing but kindness and protection. "Jacob, please be careful. Grace needs you." "We both do." The admission hung in the air between them, charged with emotions neither had expected to feel. In just 3 days, they had become something more than strangers seeking shelter. They had become a family, bound together by shared danger and the miracle of new life. "I'll be careful," Jacob promised, though they both knew the odds were stacked heavily against him. "Now go, and whatever happens, don't come out until you're certain it's safe." As Elizabeth disappeared into the hidden cellar with her daughter, Jacob took a final look around the cabin that had been his refuge for 3 years. If he died today, at least it would be for something worthwhile protecting innocent life rather than wallowing in guilt over the dead. He moved to the window and called out to the waiting men. "Charles Moreau, I'm willing to talk, but my terms are simple. You turn around and ride away, and nobody gets hurt." Charles's laughter carried clearly across the snow, cold and mocking. "I'm afraid that's not acceptable, Mr. Crane. You see, that child belongs with family, not with some hermit who's forgotten his place in the world." "The child belongs with her mother," Jacob replied firmly. "That's the beginning and end of this discussion." "How noble of you," Charles said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "But I wonder how noble you'll feel when you learn the truth about our connection. You see, Mr. Crane, we've been looking forward to this meeting for quite some time." A chill ran down Jacob's spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. "What are you talking about?" "Shiloh, April 1862. You led a charge across a cornfield that got half your company killed, including a young man named James Whitman. Does that name ring any bells, Lieutenant?" The world seemed to tilt around Jacob as the carefully buried memories came flooding back. James Whitman, 19 years old, blonde hair and eager blue eyes, full of patriotic fervor and absolute trust in his officers. Jacob remembered him perfectly. Remembered the moment he had ordered the charge across that bloody field. Remembered watching the boy fall under Confederate fire while Jacob himself had somehow made it to cover. "James was my nephew," Charles continued, his voice now carrying a note of personal satisfaction. "My sister's boy. She never got over his death, blamed the officers who led him into that slaughter. When she passed last year, she made me promise to find the man responsible and make him pay." Jacob's hand moved instinctively to Marcus Hale's pocket watch, the weight of it suddenly feeling like an anchor, dragging him down into dark waters. All these years, he had carried the guilt of Shiloh, believing his survival had been undeserved luck. Now it seemed that survival had merely postponed his reckoning. "So you see," Charles called out, "this isn't just about claiming my brother's child. This is about justice for a young man who died because of your incompetence. Two birds with one stone, as they say." The revelation hit Jacob like a physical blow, threatening to shatter the fragile confidence he had rebuilt over the past few days. Was Charles right? Had he been fooling himself about his worth, about his ability to protect Elizabeth and Grace? Maybe he deserved whatever fate awaited him in the snow outside his cabin. But then he heard it, the soft cry of baby Grace from the hidden cellar below, a sound that cut through his despair like sunlight through storm clouds. That innocent child didn't care about his past failures or his guilt over James Whitman's death. She only knew that he was the man who had helped bring her safely into the world, who had chosen to stand between her and those who would steal her away. Jacob straightened his shoulders and checked his rifle one final time. James Whitman had died at Shiloh, and that was a burden Jacob would carry for the rest of his life. But Grace Moreau was alive, and as long as he drew breath, she would stay that way. "Your 5 minutes are up, Charles," he called out, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "Make your choice." The sound of rifles being cocked carried clearly across the frozen valley, and Jacob knew that words had failed. The reckoning he had avoided for 5 long years was finally at hand, and this time there would be no retreat, no survival, through luck or chance. This time, he would have to be the man James Whitman had believed him to be. The first bullet shattered Jacob's front window like an explosion of ice crystals, sending wooden splinters flying across the cabin as Charles's men opened fire without warning. Jacob dove behind his overturned table, splinters of oak raining down on his head as more shots punched through the thick log walls with deadly precision. "Burn him out," Charles's voice carried clearly over the gunfire. "I want that baby alive, but the hermit can roast for all I care." Jacob rolled to his left and came up firing through the broken window, his rifle barking 3 times in rapid succession. One of the gunmen pitched backward from his horse with a scream, clutching his shoulder, while the others scattered for cover behind the trees at the edge of the clearing. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the cabin, mixing with the cold air pouring through the shattered glass. From somewhere in the chaos, Jacob heard the terrifying whoosh of flames catching hold. One of Charles's men had thrown a torch onto the cabin's roof, and the dry wood was already beginning to smolder despite the snow. Orange light flickered through the gaps between the logs, and Jacob knew he had minutes at most before the whole structure became a death trap. The tactical situation was hopeless. 5 men with clear fields of fire, unlimited ammunition, and now fire as their ally. Jacob's only advantages were the thick walls of his cabin and his knowledge of the surrounding terrain. But even those wouldn't matter if the roof collapsed on top of him and the hidden cellar where Elizabeth and Grace cowered in darkness. A movement at the side window caught his attention, and Jacob spun to see one of the gunmen trying to climb through the opening. He put a bullet through the man's chest at point-blank range, sending him tumbling backward into the snow with his coat on fire. The dying man's screams mixed with the crackling of flames overhead, creating a hellish symphony that reminded Jacob of the worst battles from the war. "That's 2 down," he shouted toward the trees where Charles and his remaining men had taken cover. "How many more are you willing to lose for one baby?" Charles's reply came in the form of concentrated gunfire that turned the front wall of the cabin into a sieve. Jacob pressed himself against the floor as bullets whined overhead, one passing so close to his head that he felt the wind of its passage. The smell of burning wood was getting stronger, and he could see actual flames beginning to lick down from the ceiling. Time was running out. Jacob crawled toward the kitchen area, where the entrance to the root cellar lay hidden beneath loose floorboards. He had to get Elizabeth and Grace out of there before the cabin became their tomb. But as he reached for the hidden latch, a new sound made him freeze, the unmistakable creak of someone stepping onto his back porch. He spun around to find one of Charles's gunmen standing in the rear doorway, a smoking Colt revolver in his hand and a cruel smile on his weathered face. The man was built like a bear, with arms as thick as tree trunks and scars that spoke of a lifetime of violence. His eyes held the flat, emotionless stare of a killer who had long since stopped counting his victims. "Drop the rifle, soldier boy," the gunman growled, his weapon trained on Jacob's chest. "Mr. Moreau wants to have a word with you before you die." Jacob let his rifle clatter to the floor, but his hand stayed close to the Colt at his hip. The big man was confident, maybe overconfident, and that might be the only edge Jacob could find in this deadly game. Above them, the fire was spreading rapidly across the roof, sending down showers of sparks and burning debris. "Smart move," the gunman said, stepping fully into the cabin. "Now kick that rifle away and put your hands where I can see them." Jacob complied with the first order but hesitated on the second, watching the man's eyes for any sign of distraction. The killer was good at his job. He kept his distance, maintained his sight picture, and never took his attention off his target. But he had made one crucial mistake. He had stepped directly over the hidden entrance to the root cellar. "You know," Jacob said conversationally, "Charles mentioned that he's been looking for me for years. That suggests this is personal rather than just business." The gunman shrugged, his weapon never wavering. "Don't matter to me. Money spends the same whether it's for business or pleasure. Though I admit, burning hermits ain't usually part of the job." Jacob nodded as if considering this, then suddenly dropped to one knee and yanked up the loose floorboard beneath the gunman's feet. The big man stumbled as the board gave way, throwing him off balance for just a split second. It was enough. Jacob's Colt cleared leather with the speed of long practice, the heavy revolver bucking in his hand as he put 2 bullets center mass into the gunman's chest. The man's own shot went wide, punching a hole in the wall beside Jacob's head as he toppled backward into the flames that were now consuming half the cabin. "Elizabeth," Jacob shouted toward the cellar opening. "We have to go now. The whole place is coming down." Elizabeth's pale face appeared in the opening. Baby Grace clutched protectively in her arms. Smoke was beginning to fill the small underground space, and her eyes were wide with terror as she took in the destruction above her. "The back door," Jacob said, helping her up from the cellar. "We'll make a run for the trees behind the cabin. Stay low and keep moving no matter what happens." Elizabeth nodded, her courage returning as she focused on protecting her daughter. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," Jacob lied, knowing that someone had to cover their escape. Charles and his remaining men would be watching the back of the cabin, waiting for exactly this kind of move. He kicked open the rear door and peered out into the snowy darkness. The woods were only 30 yards away, but they might as well have been 30 miles with armed men waiting in ambush. Jacob could see muzzle flashes among the trees, confirming his worst fears. "On my signal," he whispered to Elizabeth, "run straight for that big pine tree and don't look back." Jacob took a deep breath, said a quick prayer to whatever gods protected mothers and children, and burst through the doorway with both guns blazing. He moved left while Elizabeth ran right, drawing fire away from her and Grace as bullets kicked up snow all around his feet. The remaining gunmen had been expecting an escape attempt, but they hadn't been ready for Jacob's suicidal charge directly toward their position. His desperate gambit worked. Charles's men focused their fire on him, allowing Elizabeth to reach the tree line with her precious burden. Jacob heard her crashing through the underbrush, putting distance between herself and the battle, and felt a moment of fierce satisfaction even as a bullet creased his ribs. But his luck couldn't last forever. As he dove behind a fallen log, Jacob realized he was down to his last few rounds while facing at least 2 professional killers who had him pinned down in the open. Behind him, his cabin was now fully engulfed in flames, the roof beginning to collapse in showers of sparks and burning timber. "Give it up, Crane," Charles called from somewhere in the darkness. "The woman and child can't have gone far in this snow. Surrender now, and I'll make your death quick." Jacob's reply was a bullet that splintered bark inches from Charles's head, eliciting a curse from the shadows. But even as he fought, Jacob knew the mathematics of the situation were against him. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and rapidly running out of ammunition. More importantly, Elizabeth and Grace were still in terrible danger as long as Charles lived. That was when he heard it, the distant, but unmistakable sound of horses approaching through the forest at a gallop. Multiple riders, moving fast through the snow despite the treacherous conditions. Jacob's heart sank as he realized Charles must have brought even more men, a second wave to finish what the first had started. But then he heard something that made no sense at all. "This is Marshal Tom Bradley, of the territorial government." A powerful voice boomed across the clearing. "Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." Charles cursed violently from his hiding place, clearly as surprised by this development as Jacob was. "How did they find us?" The answer came from Elizabeth, who emerged from the trees with Grace still in her arms and a smoking rifle in her free hand. "I sent a letter to the marshal's office in Cheyenne before I left," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Told them Charles was planning to kidnap my baby and where he was likely to follow me." Jacob stared at her in amazement, realizing that the woman he had thought was simply a desperate refugee had actually been several steps ahead of everyone else. She had used herself and her unborn child as bait, drawing Charles into territorial jurisdiction where his money and connections couldn't protect him. "You set this up," Jacob said, not sure whether to be impressed or horrified. "You planned this whole thing." Elizabeth's smile was both sad and determined. "Daniel always said the best defense was a good offense. I couldn't run forever, so I decided to make Charles come to me on ground of my choosing." The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Charles apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. "This isn't over," he shouted as Jacob heard him crashing through the underbrush in retreat. "That child belongs with family." But his threat rang hollow now, carried away by the wind as the federal marshals closed in. Jacob slumped against the fallen log, suddenly exhausted as the adrenaline of battle began to fade. His cabin was gone, reduced to a pile of burning timber and ash, but somehow that seemed like a small price to pay for the lives of the woman and child he had sworn to protect. Elizabeth walked over to where he sat, bleeding in the snow, her daughter sleeping peacefully despite the chaos that had surrounded her birth. "Are you hurt badly?" Jacob looked down at the bullet graze along his ribs, already beginning to clot in the cold air. "I'll live. Though I have to say, your methods of problem-solving are a bit more dramatic than I'm used to." Elizabeth laughed, a sound that seemed impossibly bright in the aftermath of violence. "Sometimes the only way out is through. Besides, I had faith that you'd keep us safe until help arrived." As the federal marshals rode into the clearing with their guns drawn and their badges gleaming in the firelight, Jacob realized that something fundamental had changed in his understanding of himself and his place in the world. For 3 years, he had believed his survival at battles like Shiloh had been meaningless, a cosmic accident that mocked the deaths of better men. But perhaps survival had been preparation for this moment, when his skills and determination would mean the difference between life and death for innocents who needed protecting. The war might be over, but the fight for justice and decency would continue as long as men like Charles Moreau existed to threaten the vulnerable. And Jacob Crane, formerly lieutenant of the 5th Ohio Infantry, was apparently not done fighting yet. "Jacob Crane, you are under arrest for the murder of 3 men and the destruction of property belonging to Charles Moreau." Marshal Tom Bradley's words cut through the morning air like a blade, shattering the relief Jacob had felt at surviving the night's battle. Elizabeth stepped forward with baby Grace in her arms, her face flushed with anger. "Marshal, you can't be serious. Charles and his men attacked us. Jacob was defending our lives." Bradley was a tall, lean man with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much of the world's darkness. His badge caught the light from the smoldering remains of Jacob's cabin as he kept his hand resting on his gun butt. "Ma'am, I appreciate your position, but I have sworn statements from Mr. Moreau claiming that he came here peacefully to retrieve his late brother's child and was attacked without provocation." Jacob felt the familiar weight of injustice settling on his shoulders like an old coat. Charles had money, influence, and the ability to make lies sound like truth when spoken to the right ears. What did Jacob have to counter such power? Nothing but his word and the testimony of a desperate woman who might say anything to protect her child. "Those statements are lies," Elizabeth said firmly. "Charles threatened to kill us, If we didn't surrender Grace to him, he brought professional gunmen and tried to burn us alive in the cabin." "So you say," Bradley replied, his tone suggesting he had heard such claims before. But Mr. Moreau presents quite a different version of events. He says he offered to take legal custody of the child through proper channels and was met with rifle fire. Jacob watched this exchange with growing despair, recognizing the futility of fighting a system designed to protect men like Charles Moreau. The rich and powerful always had ways of twisting truth to serve their purposes, while ordinary people were left to face the consequences of their actions without protection or recourse. "Marshal," he said quietly, stepping forward with his hands raised, "if you're going to arrest me, then do it. But leave Elizabeth and the baby out of this. They've suffered enough." Bradley nodded and began to reach for his handcuffs, but before he could secure them around Jacob's wrists, another voice rang out across the clearing. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Tom." Everyone turned to see an older man emerging from the tree line, his silver hair gleaming in the morning sun and a badge pinned prominently to his heavy coat. Jacob recognized him immediately from newspaper illustrations. Judge Samuel Harrison, the territorial judge whose reputation for fairness and integrity was legendary throughout Wyoming. "Judge Harrison," Bradley said with obvious surprise. "What brings you out here?" Harrison walked slowly toward the group, his keen eyes taking in the burned cabin, the bodies scattered in the snow, and the exhausted faces of the survivors. "I came because I received some very interesting documents yesterday evening," he said, pulling a thick envelope from his coat. "Legal papers that shed considerable light on this situation." Elizabeth's face went pale as she recognized the envelope. "My marriage certificate and Daniel's will." "Among other things," Harrison confirmed, "including sworn affidavits from 3 different attorneys, stating that Charles Moreau has been systematically attempting to bribe or intimidate court officials into granting him custody of your unborn child." The judge's revelation hit the gathered lawmen like a thunderbolt. Marshal Bradley's hand moved away from his gun, and Jacob saw understanding begin to dawn in the other officers' faces. Charles's careful web of lies was beginning to unravel under the weight of documented evidence. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, "I have testimony from a hotel clerk in Cheyenne who witnessed Mr. Moreau hiring known criminals to retrieve what he called stolen property. I believe that property refers to Mrs. Moreau and her child." Charles himself chose that moment to emerge from the woods where he had been hiding, his expensive clothes torn and stained with blood from a bullet wound in his arm. His face was a mask of rage and desperation as he realized his carefully constructed deception was falling apart. "You don't understand," he snarled at Judge Harrison. "That child carries Moreau blood. She belongs with family, not with some farm girl who seduced my brother for his money." "Actually," Elizabeth said calmly, "I understand perfectly." She shifted Grace to one arm and pulled out a folded paper from her coat. "This is Daniel's will, written in his own hand and witnessed by his commanding officer. It specifically states that if anything happens to him, his child should be raised by me alone, away from what he called the poisonous influence of the Moreau family fortune." Jacob watched Charles's face cycle through disbelief, fury, and finally, a kind of desperate cunning as the man realized his legal position was hopeless. But Charles Moreau hadn't built his fortune by accepting defeat gracefully. "None of this matters," Charles said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Legal documents can be challenged, judges can be bought, and witnesses can be silenced. That child will be mine one way or another." The naked threat in his words galvanized everyone present. Marshal Bradley finally drew his weapon, pointing it squarely at Charles's chest. "Charles Moreau, you are under arrest for conspiracy, attempted kidnapping, and making threats against the life of a federal judge." But Charles wasn't finished yet. With the desperate speed of a cornered animal, he lunged toward Elizabeth and Grace, a hidden knife gleaming in his hand. "If I can't have the child, then no one can." Jacob moved without thinking, his body acting on instincts honed by years of combat. He threw himself between Charles and the defenseless mother and child, feeling the knife blade slice across his shoulder as he grappled with the man. They went down together in the snow, rolling and fighting for control of the weapon. The struggle lasted only seconds. Charles was desperate but soft from years of easy living, while Jacob was hardened by warfare and motivated by love stronger than his own survival. When they finally separated, Charles lay motionless in the red-stained snow, his own knife buried in his chest. "He gave me no choice," Jacob gasped, clutching his wounded shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. He was going to kill them both. Judge Harrison knelt beside Charles's body, checking for signs of life before shaking his head grimly. "Clear case of self-defense," he announced to the assembled lawmen. "This man died attempting to murder a woman and child in front of multiple witnesses." Elizabeth sank to her knees beside Jacob, her free hand pressing against his wound to slow the bleeding. "You saved our lives again," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to thank you." Jacob looked down at baby Grace, who had somehow slept through the entire violent confrontation. Her tiny face was peaceful and innocent, unmarked by the evil that had sought to claim her. In her features, he could see both her mother's strength and her father's gentleness, a perfect blend of the best qualities from both parents. "No thanks necessary," he said softly. "This is what family does for each other." The words surprised him even as he spoke them, but Jacob realized they were absolutely true. Somewhere during the past week, Elizabeth and Grace had become his family in ways that blood relation could never match. They were bound together not by genetics but by choice, by shared danger, and by love that transcended legal definitions. Marshal Bradley holstered his weapon and approached them with new respect in his eyes. "Mr. Crane, on behalf of the territorial government, I apologize for the misunderstanding. Your actions here were clearly those of a hero protecting innocent lives." Jacob accepted the apology with a nod, but his attention remained focused on Elizabeth and Grace. The immediate danger was over, but questions remained about their future together. Elizabeth was now a free woman, no longer bound by Charles's threats or legal maneuvering. She could go anywhere, do anything, build a new life wherever she chose. Would that life include a broken-down hermit who had stumbled into heroism almost by accident? "Elizabeth," he said quietly, "you're safe now. Charles is dead, and Judge Harrison can ensure his family doesn't continue the harassment. You and Grace can go anywhere you want. Start fresh somewhere without the shadow of the past hanging over you." Elizabeth looked at him with those wise green eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "And what about you, Jacob Crane? Where will you go now that your cabin is ashes?" Jacob glanced at the smoldering ruins of his home, the place where he had hidden from the world and his own guilt for 3 long years. Its destruction felt less like a loss and more like liberation from a prison he had built for himself. "I don't know," he admitted. "I suppose I'll have to figure out what comes next." Elizabeth smiled, the expression transforming her tired face with warmth and hope. "Well, Grace and I were thinking about heading to Oregon, maybe starting a small farm near my sister's place. It's beautiful country, I'm told, with good soil and clean water, but it would be hard work for a woman alone with a baby." Jacob felt his heart skip a beat as he began to understand what she was suggesting. "Are you offering me a job, Mrs. Moreau?" "I'm offering you a future, Mr. Crane, if you want it." As Jacob looked into her eyes, and then down at little Grace sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, he felt the last of his guilt and self-doubt finally beginning to fade away. The war was over, Charles Moreau was dead, and a new life stretched before them, like an uncharted territory waiting to be explored. For the first time in 5 years, Jacob Crane was ready to stop running from his past and start building something better. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, carried by a mud-splattered rider who had pushed his horse hard through the mountain passes to reach the small settlement of Pine Creek, Oregon. Jacob was splitting wood behind the cabin he had built for Elizabeth and Grace when he heard the hoofbeats, and something about the urgency of the approaching horse made his hand drift instinctively toward the colt at his hip. "Mr. Crane," the rider called out, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "I've got official correspondence from the territorial government in Wyoming. Judge Harrison said it was urgent." Jacob set down his axe and accepted the sealed envelope with a growing sense of unease. In the 6 months since they had settled in Oregon, He had hoped their troubles with the Moreau family were finally behind them. Elizabeth had legally changed her name to Elizabeth Crane after their quiet wedding ceremony in January, and little Grace was thriving in the clean mountain air. Their small farm was prospering, and Jacob had even begun teaching at the local schoolhouse 3 days a week. But the look on the messenger's face suggested their peaceful interlude was about to end. "What's this about?" Jacob asked, tearing open the official seal. "All I know is that Judge Harrison paid me double wages to get this to you as fast as possible," the writer replied, accepting the cup of coffee Elizabeth offered him through the cabin door. "Said it was a matter of life and death." Jacob unfolded the letter with hands that weren't quite steady, his eyes scanning the formal legal language until he found the paragraph that made his blood turn to ice. The words seemed to leap off the page like living things, each one a separate blow to his newfound happiness. "What is it?" Elizabeth asked, seeing the color drain from his face. "Jacob, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse than a ghost," Jacob said grimly, passing her the letter. "It's the living that are causing trouble now." Elizabeth read quickly, her face growing pale as she absorbed the contents. The letter informed them that Charles Moreau's younger brother, Vincent, had petitioned the federal court to overturn Judge Harrison's previous ruling regarding Grace's custody. Vincent claimed new evidence had come to light, proving that Elizabeth had murdered Charles in cold blood and that Jacob was her accomplice in an elaborate scheme to steal the Moreau family fortune. "This is insane," Elizabeth said, her voice shaking with anger. "Vincent wasn't even there. He was in San Francisco on business when Charles died. How can he make these accusations?" Jacob took the letter back and read the final paragraph, which contained the most chilling news of all. He's hired the law firm of Morrison and Associates out of Denver. They specialize in overturning frontier court decisions, and they have a reputation for winning cases through any means necessary. The writer, who had been listening with growing interest, suddenly spoke up. "Morrison and Associates? I've heard of them. They're the ones who got that cattle baron acquitted of murder last year, even though half the territory saw him gun down that homesteader in broad daylight." Elizabeth clutched Grace closer to her chest, the 9-month-old baby gurgling happily despite the tension that filled the air around her. "What do they want from us?" "Everything," Jacob said quietly, his mind racing through the implications. "Vincent is claiming that Grace is illegitimate because your marriage to Daniel was never properly recorded. He says Daniel was already married to a woman in Louisiana and that your ceremony was meaningless." "That's a lie," Elizabeth exclaimed. "Daniel showed me the divorce papers from his first wife. They were filed in New Orleans 3 years before we met. Papers that have mysteriously disappeared from the courthouse records," Jacob continued reading, "along with your marriage certificate and Daniel's will. It seems the Moreau family has enough money to make inconvenient documents vanish." The messenger finished his coffee and prepared to leave, but Jacob caught his arm. "Wait, is there more? What aren't you telling us?" The man looked uncomfortable, glancing between Jacob and Elizabeth before answering. "Judge Harrison wanted me to warn you that Morrison's people have already been asking questions around Pine Creek. They're offering money for anyone willing to testify about your character, your relationship, anything that might help their case." Jacob felt the familiar cold rage that had sustained him through the worst battles of the war. The Moreau family wasn't content to let the dead rest in peace. They wanted to destroy the lives of everyone who had dared to oppose them. But this time, they weren't just threatening him. They were going after Elizabeth and Grace, and that made it personal in ways that transcended mere survival. "How long do we have?" he asked. "The court hearing is scheduled for next month in Cheyenne. You'll need to be there to defend yourselves, or they'll issue a default judgment." The messenger mounted his horse and looked down at them with genuine sympathy. "Judge Harrison also wanted me to tell you that he's doing everything he can, but Morrison has connections all the way to Washington. This won't be an easy fight." As the rider disappeared down the mountain trail, Jacob and Elizabeth stood in the doorway of their cabin, holding each other and baby Grace, while the weight of impending battle settled over them like a storm cloud. 6 months of happiness, 6 months of building a life together, and now it might all be torn away by the greed and hatred of people they had hoped never to see again. "We could run," Elizabeth said quietly. Take Grace and disappear into the wilderness. There are places in Alaska or Canada where they'd never find us. Jacob considered the suggestion seriously. He had spent 3 years as a hermit before Elizabeth found him, and he knew how to vanish without a trace. They could build a new life somewhere beyond the reach of lawyers and corrupt judges, somewhere Grace could grow up free from the shadow of the Moreau name. But even as he thought about it, Jacob knew he couldn't do it. Running would mean Grace would never know her true heritage, would never understand why her parents had been forced to live in hiding. More importantly, it would mean Vincent Moreau had won, that money and corruption had triumphed over justice and love. "No," he said firmly, "we've run far enough. It's time to make a stand." Elizabeth looked up at him with a mixture of fear and admiration. "You know this could destroy us. Morrison's lawyers will dig up every mistake we've ever made, every moment of weakness, every secret we've tried to forget." Jacob thought about James Whitman and the other young soldiers who had died under his command, about the guilt and shame that had driven him into exile, about all the ways he had failed as a leader and a man. Those failures would be paraded before the court, used as weapons against his character and fitness as a father to Grace. But he also thought about the moment he had first held Grace in his arms, about the pride in Elizabeth's eyes when they had exchanged marriage vows, about the simple joy of teaching children in the Pine Creek schoolhouse. Those experiences had shown him who he could become when he stopped running from his past and started fighting for his future. "Let them dig," he said quietly. "Let them find every mistake I've ever made and parade it before the world. I'm not the same man who led those soldiers to their deaths at Shiloh. I'm not the coward who hid in the mountains for 3 years. I'm Jacob Crane, husband to Elizabeth and father to Grace, and I'll be damned if I let Vincent Moreau take my family away." Elizabeth smiled through her tears, seeing in his face the strength and determination that had first attracted her to him during that terrible winter night when she had begged for shelter. "Then we fight. All the way to the Supreme Court, if necessary." Jacob nodded, already beginning to plan their defense. They would need their own lawyers, witnesses who could testify to their character, and most importantly, they would need to find those missing documents that proved Elizabeth's marriage to Daniel was legitimate. It would be the fight of their lives, but they would not face it alone. As if sensing the importance of the moment, baby Grace reached up and grasped Jacob's finger in her tiny fist, her green eyes staring into his with the trust and love that only a child could give. In that moment, Jacob knew that no matter what Vincent Moreau and his lawyers threw at them, no matter how much money they spent or how many lies they told, they could not take away the bond that had been forged between this unlikely family. The war wasn't over after all. It was just beginning. But this time, Jacob Crane would not retreat. The courthouse in Cheyenne was packed beyond capacity on the morning of April 15th, 1868, with spectators lining the walls and spilling out into the street to witness what newspapers had dubbed the trial of the century. Jacob sat at the defendant's table beside Elizabeth, who held 1-year-old Grace in her arms, while across the aisle Vincent Moreau's team of high-priced lawyers from Morrison and Associates arranged their papers with the confidence of men who had never lost a case they cared about winning. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," began Silas Morrison himself, the legendary attorney whose silver tongue had freed more guilty men than cholera had killed. "Today you will hear a tale of deception, murder, and conspiracy that reaches to the very heart of our nation's values. The defendants want you to believe they are innocent victims, but the evidence will show they are calculating criminals who murdered a good man for his money and now seek to steal an innocent child from her rightful family." Jacob felt Elizabeth's hand squeeze his under the table as Morrison painted them as villains in a melodrama, his voice rising and falling with practiced emotion. The jury, 12 men who looked like they had never faced a day of real hardship in their lives, hung on every word, their faces already showing the prejudice that money could buy. But Jacob had not come unprepared for this battle. Sitting behind them in the gallery was an unlikely collection of allies. Judge Samuel Harrison, who had risked his own reputation to support their cause. Dr. Patterson from Beacon's Ridge, who had examined Elizabeth after Grace's birth and could testify to the circumstances. 3 former soldiers from Jacob's old regiment who had traveled from Ohio to speak on his behalf, and most surprisingly, a small, nervous-looking man in a rumpled suit who clutched a leather satchel like it contained the secrets of the universe. That man was Herbert Finch, a records clerk from New Orleans, who had spent the last month searching through dusty courthouse files on Jacob and Elizabeth's behalf. What he had found there might just save their family. Morrison continued his opening statement, weaving a narrative that portrayed Charles Moreau as a concerned uncle trying to rescue his brother's child from kidnappers. He glossed over the facts of Charles's violent assault on Jacob's cabin, instead claiming that Charles had come in peace and been murdered in cold blood by a woman desperate to keep her stolen fortune. The defense will try to convince you that Mrs. Crane's marriage to Daniel Moreau was legitimate, Morrison said, his voice dripping with disdain. But we will prove that Daniel was already married when he went through that ceremony, making Mrs. Crane nothing more than a mistress and her child a bastard, with no legal claim to the Moreau name or fortune. Elizabeth's face flushed with anger at the deliberate insult, but she remained silent as their own attorney, a young but brilliant lawyer named Thomas Ashford, rose to present their side of the story. "Gentlemen of the jury," Ashford began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute truth. "Mr. Morrison is correct about one thing. This case is indeed about deception and conspiracy. But the real criminals are not sitting at the defendant's table. They are the members of the Moreau family who have spent the last year systematically destroying evidence, bribing officials, and perjuring themselves in a desperate attempt to steal a child from the woman who gave her life." Ashford's opening was masterful, portraying Jacob and Elizabeth as honest settlers fighting against overwhelming odds to protect their family. He spoke of Jacob's war service, of his sacrifice in helping to preserve the Union, of his heroic defense of a pregnant woman against armed attackers. He painted a picture of Elizabeth as a devoted mother and wife, a woman of strength and integrity who had endured terrible hardships for the sake of her child. But it was when Ashford called Herbert Finch to the witness stand that the real fireworks began. "Mr. Finch," Ashford said gently, "please tell the court what you discovered in your search of the New Orleans courthouse records." Finch opened his leather satchel with trembling hands and withdrew a stack of yellowed documents. "I found the original divorce decree for Daniel Moreau's first marriage," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "It was filed on March 15th, 1862, more than 2 years before his marriage to Mrs. Crane." Morrison shot to his feet. "Objection! These documents could easily be forgeries." Judge Harrison, who was presiding over the case, examined the papers carefully. The seals appear authentic, and the clerk's signature matches other documents from the same period. I'll allow them into evidence. But Finch wasn't finished. "I also found something else," he continued, pulling out another document, a letter from Vincent Moreau to a courthouse clerk named Murphy, offering him $500 to remove certain files from the public records. The courtroom erupted in gasps and angry murmurs as the implications of the letter became clear. Vincent Moreau had not only tried to steal grace through legal manipulation, he had committed the crime of tampering with official government documents. Morrison's face had gone pale, but he rallied quickly. "This letter proves nothing. Anyone could have written it and signed Mr. Moreau's name." "That's true," Ashford agreed calmly, "which is why I'd like to call my next witness Patrick Murphy himself." The courthouse clerk who took the stand was a broken man, his conscience finally overcoming his greed. In a voice thick with shame, he admitted to accepting bribes from Vincent Moreau to destroy documents related to Daniel's first marriage and his subsequent union with Elizabeth. "He said it was a family matter," Murphy testified, "said the documents were causing pain to the widow and child, and that removing them would be an act of Christian charity. I needed the money for my sick wife, so I did what he asked." Vincent Moreau's carefully constructed case was crumbling before everyone's eyes, but the man himself seemed strangely calm as he watched his lawyers scramble to salvage their position. Jacob studied his face and saw something there that worried him, the look of a man who still held cards he hadn't played. That worry proved justified when Morrison called his star witness to the stand. "I call Mrs. Sarah Whitman to testify." Jacob felt his blood turn to ice as a middle-aged woman in black mourning clothes walked slowly to the witness stand. He recognized her immediately. She was the mother of James Whitman, the young soldier who had died under Jacob's command at Shiloh, the woman whose grief had supposedly driven Charles Moreau to seek revenge. "Mrs. Whitman," Morrison said gently, "please tell the court about your son James." The woman's voice was steady but filled with pain as she described her boy, bright, brave, full of patriotic fervor and trust in his officers. She spoke of receiving the news of his death, of the years of grief that had followed, of her desperate need to understand how her son had died. "And what did you learn about the circumstances of James's death?" Morrison prompted. "I learned that he died because of the criminal incompetence of his commanding officer," Mrs. Whitman said, her eyes boring into Jacob's across the courtroom. "Lieutenant Jacob Crane ordered a suicidal charge across open ground that got most of his company killed. My boy died screaming for his mother while that coward ran for cover." The words hit Jacob like physical blows, reopening wounds he had thought healed. Around him, he could feel the mood of the courtroom shifting as Morrison skillfully used the grieving mother's testimony to paint Jacob as an unfit father and potential child killer. But when Ashford cross-examined Mrs. Whitman, the truth began to emerge. "Ma'am, were you present at the Battle of Shiloh?" Ashford asked gently. "Of course not. I'm a woman." "Then how do you know the details of what happened to your son?" Mrs. Whitman hesitated. "Charles Moreau told me. He said he had spoken to survivors of the battle." "Did Mr. Moreau mention that he paid you $5,000 for your testimony today?" Morrison objected, but the damage was done. Mrs. Whitman's face crumpled as she admitted to accepting money in exchange for her testimony, her genuine grief twisted into a weapon by Vincent Moreau's manipulation. The final witness of the day was Jacob himself, who took the stand with the weight of 5 years of guilt and redemption on his shoulders. Under Ashford's gentle questioning, he told the complete story of his war service, his failures and his survival, his years of exile, and his eventual discovery of love and purpose with Elizabeth and Grace. "Do you believe you failed your men at Shiloh?" Ashford asked. "Yes," Jacob answered honestly. "I made tactical errors that cost good men their lives. I've carried that guilt every day since." "And do you believe that guilt makes you unfit to be a father to Grace?" Jacob looked across the courtroom at Elizabeth, who held their daughter with fierce protectiveness, then at the jury of 12 men who would decide their fate. "No," he said firmly. "My failures taught me the value of life, the importance of protecting the innocent, and the meaning of sacrifice. Those lessons make me a better father, not a worse one." As the trial moved toward its conclusion, Jacob felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. Win or lose, he had finally spoken his truth, had acknowledged his failures, while claiming his right to redemption. Whatever the jury decided, he would face it as the man he had become rather than the coward he had been. The verdict, when it came, was swift and decisive. Not guilty on all charges, with full custody of Grace awarded to Jacob and Elizabeth Crane. As they walked out of the courthouse together, their daughter sleeping peacefully in Elizabeth's arms, Jacob reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. He had begun as a guilt-ridden hermit hiding from the world, had become a reluctant protector, and had finally emerged as a man willing to fight for love and justice against impossible odds. The pocket watch in his vest still ticked steadily, but its rhythm no longer whispered of guilt and failure. Instead, it spoke of time moving forward, of second chances earned through courage and sacrifice, and of the endless possibility that existed when people chose love over fear. Behind them, Vincent Moreau stood on the courthouse steps, his face twisted with rage and defeat. But Jacob no longer feared the Moreau family, or their money, or their connections. He had learned that some things, love, family, honor, could not be bought or stolen or destroyed by those who served only their own greed. The war was finally over, and Jacob Crane had won the only victory that truly mattered. As they rode toward home, toward their farm in Oregon and the life they had built together, baby Grace opened her eyes and smiled at the man who had helped bring her into the world and had fought to keep her safe. In that smile, Jacob saw the future, Not perfect, perhaps, but filled with hope and possibility, and the kind of love that could transform even the most broken heart into something capable of greatness. The hermit was gone forever, replaced by a husband, a father, and a man who had finally learned that his worth was not determined by his failures, but by his willingness to fight for something greater than himself.